Welcome to anyone that has joined early. We're pretty sure we're going to be setting up to have everyone's video on screen here. So if you are with us, if you put your video on, and we'll get started in a couple minutes. All right, so let us get going. So welcome everyone. And we created functionality this time where if you have your video on, the system tells us that you'll pop up here on screen, and it would be nice to see everyone. So if you're in an environment where you can have your video on, then we get a chance to see your faces, and that just helps the entire atmosphere. Hey, here come people. Welcome, welcome. Good to see some familiar faces. So great to have you with us for the conversation here on the psychology of mental health and performance. So today's module is focused on learning how we learn. And for those that were with us in module one, a number of you had shared feedback with us, either email or through some of the work that we do together. You were telling us about your experiences. So thank you for that feedback that you sent in. Many went on to watch the video recording, shared it with colleagues, and invited colleagues to attend today's module. So for those that are joining us for the first time, nice to have you with us. Welcome. And we'll start to move into the module here. So as we said in module one, over the past years, we've heard more and more from yourselves and other business leaders about the commitment and challenges that you face in this area and how to lead this in organizations while also having greater performance. In the first module, we discussed essentials of psychological well-being and productivity, uncovering how a healthy mental life enhances our ability to achieve objectives and lead our teams with effectiveness and fairness. We also highlighted in that last module the financial cost. There's many costs, but just the financial cost alone of not having psychological safety or having mental health issues and other things in this area had costs, researched costs in the UK exceeding £56 billion per year, and in the US of about $46 million per year. And those were pre-COVID numbers. The new numbers will be out shortly and are expected to be about 20% higher. Most of us, we were talking about last time, we're not educated in this area, and after many told us about the challenges that they face in the area and wanting more of it in their teams and organizations, this brought us about to have this webinar series. This being the second one, and the next one will be in October, and we'll tell you more about that. So our aim is to go into greater detail on this subject, where we engage with latest research, expand our own understanding, and leave with thinking and approaches to bring this more into our leadership and to supporting our people. So Lorenzo, who I'll hand to in a moment, is one of JMJ's subject matter experts on this topic of psychology, mental health, and performance. He's a clinical and organizational psychologist, has consulted with us globally over 20 years, and speaks at conferences and events as an expert on this subject. So Lorenzo, great to have you with us to walk us through this. If you take me to the next slide, as a reminder, please have your cameras on if you can, and your microphones I think might be on automatically on mute. Great to be able to see everyone while we're together. If you have questions while Lorenzo's presenting, you can include them into the group chat, or if you prefer, you can send them to me privately. I'll collect them and ask some questions of Lorenzo in about the last 10 or 12 minutes of our time together, and get to have a chance for a bit of a Q&A. So again, great to have you here with us, and Lorenzo, over to you.
Great, fantastic. Thank you very much, Michael. It's truly a pleasure to have you all back with us, and it's great to see you on camera. Let me just say a comment on that, because Michael mentioned if you can have your cameras open and blah, blah, blah. And just a neuroscientific fact about seeing people on camera. Why is that important? for human beings, for the human brain, to see people visually, for those of us that can, is so important that we have a specific part of our brain which is dedicated exclusively to face recognition. There are some unfortunate people that have a neurological disorder which is called prosopagnosia, which is they become incapable of recognizing other people's faces, even the faces of people that they know well. So it's so important for us to connect with other people's faces that we have a specific part of our brain which is dedicated to that. And it's much less tiring. So if you're someone like myself, and many of us that spend many hours per day in virtual meetings, I would suggest that you always invite your colleagues to have their cameras on, because it's less tiring for your brain. The human brain is not designed to interact with dots on the screen. Literally, this is a new thing that nature hasn't provided us yet with. We are designed to interact with people's faces, with their eyes, with their smiles. If you interact with dots on a screen, there is a part of your brain activity that will be very busy with trying to figuring out if the people that you're talking to, they are asleep, if they're listening, if they're doing something else. So you're gonna get at the end of a meeting much more tired than if you can see people on camera. I think that's just an interesting fact, given that we're speaking about the brain a lot in these sessions. So as Michael said, we are at session number 2 out of 3. Just as a reminder for everybody, we started with psychological safety and psychological well-being and mental health at an individual level. Today, we're gonna look into how we learn, and I'll tell you exactly why we're looking into that into a moment. And in October, we're actually gonna look at how can we create environments that allows for increased performance. So the more we go forward, the more we move towards the end of these sessions, the more we're going to bring the focus from an individual theme to a group level. I know that many of the people here, you guys manage teams, so probably you're here interested in knowing things about yourself, but also on how can you somehow bring these notions to your management style and your leadership style. And today we're starting to look into that, and session number 3 even more. Today's agenda, very quickly, brief review on performance, learning, and psychological safety. We're gonna then jump into what are some false notions that we have about learning, and then the good, the bad, and the ugly about learning. What does learning really means? How does that really work in our brains to learn? And then how we learn new behaviors. One thing is to learn mathematics. One thing is to learn French literature or American history from a book or from a YouTube video. A different thing is to learn behaviors. It's 2 different mechanisms, 2 different processes. So we're gonna focus more on how do we learn new behaviors. And then obviously, as usual at the end, before the end, we're gonna have a question and answer. So going back to where we left last time, we were looking at these 3 ideas where we were saying basically that psychological safety is a belief that I have, is an internal conviction that I have about the environment around me. And it's a belief where I tend to think, consciously or unconsciously, that the environment around me is a place where I can express myself freely. I can express my opinion. I feel safe in the sense that I feel there is no particular threat if I make a mistake. There is no particular danger if I am being myself. It's an environment that is safe. So psychological safety is a belief that I have about the environment around me. Psychological safety as a belief helps me feeling psychologically okay. Meaning, to be psychologically safe is one of the most important components to feel psychological well-being. Psychological well-being is the experience that I have about my inner world. Okay? My inner world means, how am I doing emotionally? Do I feel okay? Do I feel stressed? Do I feel happy? Do I feel frustrated? Okay? Now, psychological safety and psychological well-being are 2 main factors that contribute to my overall condition of mental health. You know, sometimes I can feel very happy, but maybe my mental health is not in a good state. It might be just a temporary feeling that I have about myself. So we made these three distinctions between psychological safety as a belief about a domain, an environment, psychological well-being as an experience that I have about my inner world, and mental health as a condition in which I find myself to be over a certain period of time, same as physical health. We also stressed the notion that as managers, where you have your biggest impact is in the psychologically safety aspect, meaning that you can have an influence on people's mental health and people's psychological well-being, but the variables inside of people's mental health and psychological well-being, many of them are outside of your control. But if you manage a group of people, you have a lot of access, a lot of influence at creating an environment for them where they feel okay. The environment itself is safe. You have the same, using an analogy, you have the same impact that a teacher has in the mood of a classroom where kids are in school. A teacher is responsible for teaching a subject, but even more, a teacher is responsible for creating an environment where learning can happen. And learning happens in different ways depending on the environment in which we are. And that's why we brought the topic of learning today. And the topic of learning is extremely important for human beings because you and I, our species, is designed to learn. Our survival depends on learning. From the moment in which you are born till the last breath that you have in your life, your brain will learn. Sometimes we'll unlearn. It goes through the opposite process. But generally, being alive for our brains means to gather feedback from the environment and to learn what? Learn to adapt. Okay, so one of the reasons why session 2 of our 3 series webinar is about learning is because if you are interested in people's performance, to create a learning in a positive, I'm going to begin to qualify it now, to create a positive learning environment is probably your number one access to their performance. Why is that? Is because learning fundamentally means to become better at something. So again, here we're not speaking necessarily about learning French literature or Italian Renaissance art. We're speaking about learning new behaviors, learning to do things in a way which is better than the way in which we used to do it in the past. Okay, so if you look at this slide here, it says learning means to become better at something, to reduce a gap. Now, what gap? The gap between a behavior and the expected outcome that I want that behavior to produce. So what does that mean basically? It means that we are designed, our brains are designed to constantly assess if what we're doing is producing the outcome that we wanted or not. And when it doesn't, if what we're doing doesn't produce the outcome that we want, either by ourselves or some other people, we experience a gap. Okay? Now we call that gap failures, mistakes, however we want to call it. Oftentimes there is an emotional state, we will see in a moment, which is associated with that gap. But the notion of learning and the notion of making mistakes and failing at producing an outcome, they go together. Now that's where a lot of us, we struggle. So I'm underlining that again. We don't learn unless we make mistakes. We'll see that in a moment, but please have that if you want as your first bullet point of today's content. Learning comes with making mistakes. They come together. It's like if you flip a coin, there's the head and tail. They come together. You can split one, you can't split one from the other. Okay? So learning is about perceiving a gap between a behavior, an action, and the expectation of an outcome that that action or behavior is going to produce. If I don't have that gap, there is no learning. Now, we'll see in a moment, the problem is that we don't like that gap necessarily most of the time. Okay, so emotions, negative emotions that come in between us and the process of learning what we would like to learn. Why does our brain learn? It's because it's energy efficient. It's no more romantic than that. It's no more noble than that. We don't learn because we aspire to be better. Yeah, maybe, okay, later, right? But the first thing is we learn because it's energy efficient for our brain to learn. If I become better at something, it means that I have to use less brain energy. If you want a simple daily life example to that, please try to remember how much did you sweat when you took your first driving lesson. If you go back with your memory, okay, you got into the car next to your partner, your brother, your father, your sister, whoever, the teacher, whoever, and then you started your driving lesson. After that 45 minutes or first 60 minutes of driving lesson, probably you were exhausted. Now, if you're an experienced driver, most of the time you drive for 20 miles, and if it's a common road that you're taking every day, you don't even remember what you did. That's how efficient you have become. That's how efficient your brain has become in managing the energy that goes into the process of driving. The process of driving is extremely complex. You have to do something with your hands, you have to do something with your eyes, you have to do something with your legs, with your feet. You have to pay attention to what goes on with you, what goes on in the traffic, what goes on in the car. Extremely complex process. And most of us, when we drive to the office on a daily basis, we don't even remember the road that we took. And we don't even remember how many gears we switched. That's energy efficient. And that's what the brain does. That's how we learn. When you learn something, it becomes extremely efficient in terms of saving the energy. A few false myths around learning. First one is learning always makes you a better person. Not necessarily. Learning is not always for the better. This is the first or second important point of this session today. We don't always learn positive things. We don't learn when we want. We learn all the time. So depending on what's your environment, you're gonna learn good behaviors or you're gonna learn bad behaviors. Learning is a process, most of which happens at an unconscious level. Again, we're not talking about I'm opening a book and I'm learning Shakespeare. Yeah, that's all right, that's conscious. No, it's about I'm in a room with 15 people in a meeting and somehow I am learning how to behave in that meeting by virtue of being with them. Learning for human beings happens all the time, non-stop, even when you're sleeping, because you learn inside of your dreams. So learning is not always for the better. It depends what you expose yourself to. It depends what are the inputs that you're receiving from the environment. Bad environment equal learning bad habits, okay? Learning bad habits or learning good habits, same process, doesn't change. The brain doesn't make any moral judgment on that, okay? I'm reading the one in bold and then you can ask questions if you want on the others later on. We shouldn't focus on mistakes. There's a big sort of philosophy going on nowadays, especially in business, about, oh, we should learn from what we're doing well. We shouldn't focus on mistakes. That is mambo jumbo, hama hama. Okay, learning doesn't happen from what we are already doing well. If we are doing it well, the brain parks it as, I'm done with that. I know how to do it. Okay, we learn from mistakes. Now, what does that mean? It means that what you and I are doing well becomes transparent, like the driving example. So you can't learn from what you're already good at. You can improve by understanding inside of what you're not doing well, what are some gaps that you still find. Okay, so if you're very good at mathematics, you can still find some gaps, some new challenges, some more difficult challenges. But we need a gap to learn. So the point is not that we should not focus on mistakes. You should. Please do focus on mistakes. Now, the point there is, can we make mistakes tolerable for ourselves? Can we make mistakes acceptable? Can we make mistakes something that people are not afraid of? That's the biggest challenge about learning. Because mistakes is your playground for learning. But if we want people to learn the right lessons from mistakes, as kids are supposed to do in school, then we have to make sure that mistakes, they don't show up for people as a threat. That's the biggest challenge for teachers in school, for parents at home, and for managers in the business environment. How can I create an environment where mistakes do not occur for people as a threat of punishment? So therefore, I'm creating a learning environment, meaning people don't aim to make mistakes, but we know that mistakes will happen. We try to avoid them, but when they do happen, people have a sufficiently, let's not be too optimistic, they have a sufficiently serene relationship to their mistakes that allows for a learning phenomenon to happen. That's the challenge of learning. Number 5, for those of us that used to be young, learning capabilities decline with age. Not true, okay? So if you're looking at your retirement years thinking, oh, I'm gonna be less intelligent, not true, okay? Learning capabilities decline with lack of brain cells utilization, meaning your brain, unless if you don't suffer from any neurological condition, such as Parkinson or Alzheimer's or neurodegenerative disorders, if you're okay from a health point of view, your brain is gonna stay as sharp as long as you use it. What does it mean to use the brain in a way that keeps it sharp? It means to use the brain for thinking new things, exploring new ideas, new concepts, learning a new language, reading a new book, watching content that makes you think. The neurocells, here's the tricky thing about the brain. The neurocells that you do not use, they die. And once they're dead, they do not come back. That's the problem, okay, with brain. Neurocells that die, they don't regenerate themselves. And because of that energy efficiency mechanism that we looked into earlier on, the brain is going to keep alive only the neurocells that it finds out are the ones that are needed and used. So the less you think, the less intelligent you become. The more you think, the more you exercise your brain, the more intelligent you either become or you keep yourself in terms of learning capabilities. Intelligence, number 7, is fixed at birth. Again, for those of us that are parents or are interested in this kind of stuff, that is not true. Intelligence is not fixed at birth. Again, with the exception of some disabilities, if everything goes well during the 9 months of gestation and you come into the world, you're gonna end up by the age of 16, 18, depending if you're a man or a woman, with approximately 80 billion neurocells, not all of which are going to be used for thinking. Thinking requires much less neurocells, but intelligence grows and shrinks depending on environmental exposure and individual practice. So we come into the world with the same package, and then it's all about the environment to which we are exposed to and individual practice of how I use my brain, okay? So intelligence is not fixed at birth. And then there are some other things like you're either right or left-brained, not true, okay? Both hemispheres, they work together, etc., etc. Okay, so I wanna stick, if you don't mind, with the notion that bad environment equals learning bad habits, or good environment equals learning good habits. So this notion about learning happens as an adaptive process. So learning is about me adapting to the environment inside of which I am. That's what learning is about. So this looks like an Italian flag upside down, more or less, but it means this thing. You can imagine learning to happen on a continuum, okay? So if you look here in the middle, okay? But to simplify, it can go into different directions. You can have a type of learning that happens for aiming at self-preservation. So I am learning behaviors, I'm reading the environment and I feel that I need to learn behaviors, habits, and practices to survive, to make myself okay in this environment. Self-preservation oriented learning. Okay, typical example is I'm in a meeting, a colleague of mine says something, he or she is against the decision that we're taking, and he's receiving negative feedback. He's been told he's not proactive, you're not bringing enthusiasm, shut up. Okay, I witnessed that. Well, I'm gonna learn right away what's the right attitude to have in that meeting. That is self-oriented learning. Okay, then there is performance-oriented learning, the one that goes towards the green area, light blue area. Now that's slightly different. That's the kind of learning where what comes into place is not me having to defend myself, but there I'm seeking for improvement. Can you hear the difference between these two brains activity? The first one is about protecting oneself. Therefore, it has a focus which is about avoiding risk. It has a focus which is about trying to find a way out. It has a focus which is about reducing the risk of getting hurt. That's where all of your self-defense mechanisms that come into play, all of them are unconscious, obviously, to make life fun, okay? So when you are inside of an environment which is fundamentally influenced by fear, if you were with us in the last session, you may remember what happens to your brain when fear kicks in. When fear kicks in, you have a rush of adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisols. These are the three hormones of stress. In the short run, adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol. In the short term, they make you focused and concentrated. In the long run, if you suffer from chronic stress, they destroy your immune system and your health. So an environment which is pretty much influenced by different levels of fear, what people are learning is self-preserving behaviors. It's not that they're not learning. You know, there is this distinction that people are making, especially in business management, where they're saying, oh, you're not creating a learning environment. You're always creating a learning environment, all the time if you're a manager. The point is what you're training your people into. What is that they're learning? Are they learning how to survive you? Are they learning how to survive the next KPI conversation? Are they learning how to survive the next whatever you guys are using in your organization to determine your goals, their performance review? Or are we creating an environment where people are focused on looking at their mistakes as a way to understand how to adapt better in a positive way? That's the distinction that we need to be making as managers or as leaders, because you are constantly creating a learning environment if you are in a position of authority. By a position of authority, I mean if you manage someone, if you are a parent, if you are a teacher, if you are in any role where people are looking at you to find out how they are supposed to behave. Okay, we're gonna look at that in a moment. So in a fear-influenced environment, people are learning self-preservation strategy. Now, what creates fear in an environment? We're gonna speak about that more in the next session, but just mention it. What creates fear for people, especially in a work environment? Unpredictability. Human beings don't like unpredictability. People that suffer from anxiety disorder, they tend to transform the unpredictability of the future into bad scenarios. That's what creates anxiety. When you look into the future and you don't see the future as unpredictable anymore, you see it as predictably bad. Unfairness of treatment, lack of transparencies, excessive emphasis on results. When, as managers, we keep speaking about results and targets, and a performance-oriented environment becomes too stressful for people. Unreasonable timelines, chronic stress, lack of recognition, etc., etc., etc. Okay, these are all elements that influence the environment to be driven by fear. Now, fear doesn't mean horror. Doesn't mean you have to be in a horror movie. We're not speaking about that level of fear. We're speaking about the subtle level of anxiety that people may experience when in management meetings, when in board meetings, when in performance reviews, so forth and so on. The emotions that we feel, okay, this is wrong, sorry, that's a mistake. The emotions that we feel, they are actually stress, fear, worry, anxiety, okay? And the mental activity is justification, defensive strategies, figuring out who's guilty, rationalization, okay? What people usually refer to as a blame culture. You've heard that expression in business. A blame culture fundamentally can grow inside of a fear-driven or fear-influenced environment. Why is that? Is because blaming others is a self-preservation strategy. Why am I blaming others? Why am I accusing other people? Because it takes me off the hook. Okay, it's a way of putting the spotlight on someone else. Okay, behaviors that we learn. Now, this is the interesting part. People learn behaviors in that kind of environment. What kind of behaviors? Aggression, inhibition, I'm gonna shut up. Passive aggression, we're very familiar with that. Argumentation, misrepresentation. It's like when you get the data which does not represent reality. Hiding, blaming, lying, etc., etc. These are all behaviors that if you take a 2-year-old kid, they don't know these behaviors very well. By the age of 6, they know these behaviors brilliantly. Okay, it doesn't take long for human beings to learn these behaviors. Your kids, they know how to lie to you. Okay, how come they know how to lie to you? Well, that's because they saw you lying. They saw me lying. Okay, so they learned that, and they lie when they feel that that's a good way not to be punished. Somehow in their mind, somehow in their heads, that's the response to get themselves out of a situation where somehow they fear what could happen to them. Now it makes sense. A psychologically safe environment fosters a kind of learning which, once again, the focus is not on me anymore. The focus is not on how can I get out of trouble. The focus is how can I do this task better. That's the kind of learning that we usually call learning, and we call here a performance-oriented learning. So what promotes that kind of an environment? Transparency, trust, fairness, information flow, feedback loops, meaning people are receiving feedback, fair amount of feedback, okay, about the performance and how they are operating. Managerial openness, that means I know I can trust my manager to listen to me, and if I ask questions, I'm receiving answers. I'm not kept in the dark, and I don't show up as an idiot if I have to ask questions because I haven't understood things. Permission to innovate. Now, companies, they like that, right? As managers, we do like innovation. We want our people to innovate. Well, innovation can't happen here. Can't. Here you cannot innovate. Your brain doesn't have the energy, doesn't have the focus that allows you to innovate. For innovation to happen, you need this, okay? You need a certain level of curiosity, interest, strategic thinking, creativity, openness. You need people to ask questions. People ask questions when they feel safe. When people ask questions, then they learn. Okay, then the behaviors, you see them here. Now this one is particularly interesting for me, owning mistakes. What does that mean? It means that people, when a mistake happens, they will have a negative reaction. Now let's be clear about this one. You cannot eliminate emotionally negative response from making a mistake. Okay, we can't redesign the human brain. So whenever you and I are making a mistake, there is going to be an emotionally negative response. But then people feel sufficiently safe that they can be with the negative emotional response They can accept it, they can include it as, okay, this is happening to me, and there is sufficient tranquility, there is sufficient space in their mind to go like, all right, what did I do wrong? How can we adapt? How can I do things in a different way? That kind of questioning means owning a mistake. What we usually do in a fear-driven environment is that we run away from mistakes. So once again, I know I'm repeating myself, okay? But learning comes from mistakes. The real question for people that are in a leadership position is, how do I create an environment where people, I'm not saying they would welcome mistakes, because if people are welcoming mistakes, you want to question a little bit their mental health, really. But people are okay that mistakes are going to happen. And when mistakes happen, they are willing to speak about them. Fundamentally, they are willing to tell the truth about them. They don't have to hide. Okay, so that's the real challenge with learning in a performance-oriented way. Last couple of concepts that we're looking into today is, how does learning of new behaviors happen for human beings? Okay, so once again, here we're not talking about learning geography or mathematics. We're talking about, how do I pick up new behaviors? How do I learn new ways of doing things? How do I learn new habits? Social learning theory formulated by a psychologist called Albert Bandura a few years ago. 4 ways in which you and I learn behaviors: observation, fascination, imitation, participation. Okay, let's say the easiest to understand is fascination, and it's the least common one, because fascination happens when you go and see a Pink Floyd concert or whoever you love, and you come back home and you suddenly want to pick up the guitar and become David Gilmour. David Gilmour is the Pink Floyd guitarist. You're fascinated by what you've seen. You go to the museum, you see a Caravaggio, you come back home, and now you want to be a painter. And you took painting classes. Plenty of painting classes if you want to be like Caravaggio, but you have to start somewhere. So that's fascination. Then observation, imitation, and participations are the one which are the most common one in the business environment, in the social environment, I would say. Observation is very straightforward and simple. We watch people all the time, and we watch 2 kinds of people in this perspective: our peers and people in charge. And we look at our peers to understand if we are new, how did they adapt to the environment that I am new in and they are not new in. And we look at people in charge in order to figure out, mentalize for ourselves, what do we think that their expectation of us is going to be. So we observe our peers and we observe people in charge. If you are a manager, if you are in a leading position, you are under the spotlight all the time. People are looking at what you do, consciously or unconsciously, in order to figure out what they have to do. Okay, it's called behavioral influence. Hence all the theory and blah, blah, blah around visible leadership, obviously. Imitation, same thing. Okay, if you send messages every Friday night at midnight, at some point, people in your team are going to begin to send messages on Friday night at 11. Okay, we are imitating animals. Okay, and who do we imitate? We imitate those that we think are adapting better to the environment, even if that means imitating bad behaviors. Okay. Participation is we participate into activities and we learn by being involved in activities with other people. Okay, pretty straightforward. That's why when we have meetings together, we don't just talk to each other. We are learning by virtue of being together. Okay. Now, last piece here, which is interesting. This is a normal distribution. What does that mean is normalization of behaviors. Over time, people will adapt to what they perceive to be normal in an environment. That is the key element of any cultural transformation in any organization. People will adapt to what they perceive to be normal. Think about a simple example. When you go to see the movies at the cinema, imagine you sit there and then at some point your husband, wife, partner, friend, whoever tells you, oh, I forgot I wanted popcorn. So you go out, you go to buy popcorns, you come back into the movie theater, and now there is Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt on the screen, the movie has started. And you have to go from the entrance of the movie theater room to the place where you're sitting. And you have to walk in front of everybody, and everybody is watching the movie. Okay, there is this moment. Now, usually what you do is you try to shrink to occupy as little space as possible. You walk very carefully. You try not to bother anybody. Your physical posture, your thinking, your emotions, you feel a little embarrassed. You think, why did they not tell me before to go and buy the popcorn? So your emotions, your body, your cognitive process is all completely influenced by the environment. You didn't take any training or any briefing before entering the movie theater room on how to behave, but you immediately adapted. You look at tourists outside of the church, outside of museums, they are loud, they eat, they scream, they talk on the phone, they smoke cigarettes, they are half naked if you come to Italy this time of the year. The moment in which they enter into the cathedral, everybody goes quiet. Everybody goes respectful. Everybody stop eating, smoking. We all switch into a different kind of behavior. Why? Because we are designed by nature to perceive what is considered to be the normal behavior in that environment. That does not mean that there are no exceptions. But if you see someone smoking inside of the Florence Cathedral, you will think that that person is weird. And that's how we keep the culture influencing people's behaviors. Why? Because people's behaviors will always adapt to the norm. It's a question of survival. So if you're interested in cultural change, the first question to ask oneself is, what's the norm? Apart from all the corporate blah, 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 what is perceived to be the normal behavior around here? And people, they figure out what's the normal behavior around here, not by looking at the corporate messages on the PowerPoints, but by observing what other people do and what the leaders do. Okay. Last slide that I have for today. This is just a way to introduce our session in October, after the summer. How do you influence an environment? Well, first of all, need to understand what the environment is. Okay. An environment is the aggregate of external agents or conditions, social, cultural, physical, biological, that influence the functions of an organism. Meaning, well, the environment is everything that is going on around people that influences their brain content. Remember, the brain is a machine which is always in a feedback loop with the environment. So how do I influence the environment? Well, the first thing is you have to understand it. You have to somehow have a diagnostic of the environment. What does a diagnostic mean? It's like when you go to the doctor. First thing that he does is he asks you or she asks you a whole bunch of questions to understand what's going on with you. Okay, so that's the first thing. And it's about asking questions that tell you insights inside of people's perception. Can you make a diagnostic about the level of psychological safety in an organization, in an environment? Yes, you can, in the same way that somehow you can have a feel of what is the perceived norm. It takes to inquire with people. And then there is cultural contamination strategy. We will speak about that in the next session. So how do you go from micro environments, like the one in which we are today, a group of 40 people, into how do you contaminate with the right behaviors 20,000 people? Okay, there are ways to do that if we understand properly that that's how human beings learn new behaviors. If we don't understand these, then, so to speak, cultural contamination strategies, they will always be quite disappointing, or they're gonna end up producing outcomes that we didn't expect. All right, Michael, I see you're opening your microphone, which is my cue to understand that I should shut up. And maybe it's time for questions if we have received them.
Thank you. So again, if anyone wants to send me a message in the group or in personally, I'll have a look at those, and if we have time, I'll ask as many as I can. So I've got a few here to start with, Lorenzo. So, and I think a little bit of context is needed. So we have people in the meeting here that oversee projects in the billions.
Yes.
We know that performance is key. Of course, they care about safety and they care about the people, and they know that to attract kind of the A team, they need to take care of people. But at the end of the day, we're all hired to get projects done, right?
Yes.
And over the line on time. That doesn't always lead to a lot of time for creating a learning environment and looking after cycle. I mean, these are all, in a way, complex pieces or competing commitments. Yes. So in that kind of an atmosphere, with those kind of pressures and time constraints and so forth, how do managers or what would managers need to do to create a learning environment that's in service of the project performance?
Okay, I'm gonna try to give a short answer. To create a positive learning environment, a performance-oriented learning environment doesn't take more time than to create a self-preservation oriented environment, because people are always learning. So to create a positive learning environment doesn't require more time. It requires to spend the time that you're spending on negative behaviors, so to speak, into different behaviors. So the time that you spend on blaming people, blaming people doesn't take less time than to understand that mistakes are part of the journey. I don't know if I'm making sense, but to learn positive things doesn't require more time than to learn bad habits. The problem might be that we are used to blame much more, or we are used to put people under pressure much more because it gives us the illusion of control. But to create this kind of environment that you see in green here doesn't require more time. Okay, it requires different type of interactions. That, yes. It requires a different kind of interest that you have in people. That, yes. So for a different session where we may have more time, or if people here are interested in a longer explanation, I would say you have to unpack a different kind of question, which is what are the behaviors and the habits that I need to promote as a manager to create that environment. Forget about it takes time. It doesn't take more time. It takes less time. We have all been through an exercise where you try to help your kids to do a mathematical exercise that they can't do. The more you get frustrated and angry, the longer it takes.
It's very interesting because part of our upbringing, right, and society has been push and force and make people wrong, and somehow that's going to get the result. But it actually, like you say, takes far more time than seeking to understand and working with people for solutions and helping them to think.
I agree. I think one of the things that it takes to create a performance-oriented environment is it takes more courage. Okay, because it takes more vulnerability. It takes more intellectual honesty. To put pressure on people, it's a shortcut that gives you the illusion of control, provides them with nothing, if not stress, and definitely doesn't produce additional performance. But it gives you, the person in charge, if you are, the impression of being in control, which is a very important psychological element, because it gives me an illusion of, okay, all right, now I made an impact, now I made a difference. Illusions for the brain are as important as reality. But in reality, they don't produce results. They are illusions.
Yeah. Yeah. So a follow-on that just came through in the chat, how do we improve our executive function of our frontal cortex? This is a good Lorenzo question. How do we improve our executive function of our frontal cortex when faced with failures or when things do not go as planned?
That person will never know the answer because it's dropped in the meantime, but it's a good question for everybody else.
Yes.
When you're facing failure, the first thing that we need to be aware of is that you will be invaded, your brain will be flooded with a certain amount of negative emotions, fear, sorrow, worry, okay? And there is nothing you can do about that. Somehow you have to allow your brain to deal with the negative emotions that are coming from the automatic natural response to failure. You have to absorb that. You have to take the time and do whatever you need to do in order for you to digest and your brain to process the amount of adrenaline and noradrenaline that is associated with the notion of failure. Human beings don't like failures. That's not a choice. Nature decided that for us. We don't like failure. Okay, whoever tells you, well, let's embrace failure, yeah, whatever, cheap book. Okay, we don't like failure. So failure is always associated with a certain amount of negative emotion. First thing is to take that emotion in. Do whatever you need to do in order to cope with that emotion in a sufficiently healthy way. At some point, the level of adrenaline and the intracranial amount of pressure and temperature in your brain will decrease. And you can help that process by doing very natural things such as go for a walk outside, breathe in fresh air from your nose, do half an hour of meditation if meditation is something you like, go for a swim, do anything that is going to reduce the intracranial pressure and temperature of your brain, that is going to allow for that adrenaline rush that comes with failure to go away. That is going to free your prefrontal cortex executive function to light up again. And now you can think again as a proper human being. And that's something that you have to repeat as a process as many times as you need. It's not a once and for all kind of process. That's the short answer, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so then let's go a little bit more simple then, even though it's not really simple. How can you measure the amount of psychological safety in a given environment? So here we are talking about it. Here we all are, many here are joining us for this reason.
Yeah.
How do I find out?
So everything that has to do with psychology can't be quantified directly. So you can't have, you could bring all of your people to do a blood test every day, measure their dopamine levels and their serotonin levels and their adrenaline levels, and then do the same blood test at the end of the working day. Probably you will violate a certain amount of HR policies by doing that, and it's not very practical. So given that you can't do that, there are ways to measure the perceived psychological safety of an environment. So psychological safety, remember, is not, you can't have 5 kilos of psychological safety. Psychological safety is a perception that people have of the environment inside of which they are. So you can definitely measure that. And what you need to know is what are the elements that create psychological safety. So for example, you have to, and you can, measure the things that you see up here. How do people perceive the level of transparency inside of their microenvironment? Don't go like, do you perceive that there is transparency in our company of 150,000 people? That question doesn't mean anything. First, you have to draw the perimeter. You have to draw the environment that you want to test. And then you have to look for the tools that allow you to measure the elements that constitute the perception of psychological safety. For example, the levels of stress, the level of transparency, the ways in which people get recognized formally and informally, the level of unpredictability of perceived future, etc., etc. So you have to deconstruct the perception of psychological safety. You need experts to do that. And then what you test is how much of these elements are present in the micro or medium environment that you have selected. And then if you want to export that to a much larger environment, then you have to repeat that process. And then you can come up with is our company a psychologically safe environment? But first you have to go micro. Is our team a psychologically safe environment? Is our region, is our layer of manager? You can go by layers, okay? I don't know if I'm answering, I hope I'm answering enough, but you have to deconstruct the element and test for, are these elements present in people's perception? And that's something you can do, we do it. And I find it an incredibly useful tool, because that tells you right away if all of the efforts you're gonna do to implement any strategy you wanna implement are gonna be fruitful or not. Because if the environment inside of which you're gonna try to implement any business strategy is not psychologically safe, any strategy that you will try to implement will receive passive aggressive or straightforward aggressive resistance from people.
All right, so then one lightning round question, given we have 2 minutes left. So I'll give you 1 minute to answer the question, and then if you then put on the last slide so people just see what's coming next. So all that in 2 minutes. So
Cool.
Lightning round question is, how does learning relate to innovation?
Oh, you can't have innovation without learning. If you don't learn, you don't innovate, you repeat. That this, repeat until, that programmers that code software repeat until. That's what we do when we don't learn. We stay in a vicious circle. We repeat the past.
Yeah, and then we want more performance and more efficiencies and staying competitive.
Yeah,
but
again, that's the illusion of control. Yeah. Innovation only happens with the prefrontal cortex executives. Cognitive capacities are free to do their job. So it requires thinking. If you inhibit thinking, learning doesn't happen. If you inhibit learning, innovation doesn't happen. Then you can get as angry as you want and looking at Excel spreadsheets and pipeline and hoping for better revenues, but that's in the domain of astrology, not in the domain of management.
Point taken. So then if you show us that last slide, Lorenzo, and we can just wrap up. And I'll just say at this point, thank you to everyone for your participation. It's been a pleasure to have you with us and great to be able to see you this time. So thanks for having your videos on. As a reminder, the next session is the 9th of October. You'll receive reminders and a link to join as the time gets closer. And as with last time, you'll get the slides, the recording from today, and any list of books or articles that Lorenzo referenced. If you have colleagues that you want to include, you can send them the recording and they're welcome to join us on the 9th of October. And great to have you with us. And we bid you a farewell.
Great. Fantastic to be with you all again. Thank you so much for listening and for your patience, and hopefully see you next time. Have a fantastic summer, everybody.
Bye.